Hello, my name is Mauricio, and welcome to the talk, Longtermism and Economic Growth. I'm thrilled to introduce you to Professor Hilary Greaves. Hilary Greaves is a professor of philosophy at the University of Oxford and director of the Global Priorities Institute. Her main current research focus is on issues of global prioritization. Besides that, her interests include foundational issues in consequentialism, interpersonal aggregation, population ethics, moral uncertainty, the interface between ethics and economics, and formal epistemology. Today, she'll be discussing considerations for and against the view that rapid economic growth is good for the long-term future. We invite you to use the Swapcard platform during the session. On the right side panel, feel free to share your thoughts on the live discussion board and leave and upvote any questions for our speaker to answer at the end of the presentation. After the session, we invite you to use Swapcard to set up meetings with fellow conference attendees. Without further ado, welcome.
My talk's about the relationship between a long-termist point of view and considerations of economic growth. By long-termism here, I just mean, fairly roughly, a particular concern with the far future effects of our actions, in particular, say, the effects from 100 years from now on forwards. The overarching question I want to take on is, from a perspective that's long-termist in that sense, what should we think about how good, or perhaps even how bad, economic growth is, and why exactly? Setting aside long-termism, I take the orthodox point of view to be roughly that kind of obviously, the more economic growth, the better. That seems to follow almost trivially insofar as a preference satisfaction approach to well-being is onto anything at all. But plausibly, from a long-termist point of view, things are somewhat less obvious. I'll canvass three strands of thought in this intersection of long-termist thought and considerations of economic growth. The first argument associated with Tyler Cowen is that a long-termist point of view, Cowen thinks, really makes the well-being effects of faster consumption growth super important, to the point where this is boosting economic growth is just the most important thing because of well-being rising with consumption. Secondly, an argument due to Benjamin Friedman to the effect that faster economic growth is good because altruism and morality can solve many of the world's problems, and those things in turn are promoted by economic growth. And then thirdly, I'll talk about the relationship between economic growth and existential risk. So by way of outline of the talk, I've got three main sections of the talk taking on those three arguments. When I get to talking about economic growth and existential risk, specifically I want to suggest that the distinction between state risks and transition risks can be fruitful here for organising thoughts. It seems to me that the interactions between existential risk on the one hand and economic growth on the other hand play out quite differently in the case of state risks versus transition risks. Insofar as it's possible to draw an overall conclusion with a determinate valence from my arguments, if anything, it seems to me that the arguments I canvass in this talk harbour some suggestion that slower economic growth might be better, perhaps surprisingly, although I want to stress that this is only a conversation starter, the thoughts are very inchoate and so forth. Firstly, economic growth and well-being. There's a question in the background about whether above some minimum subsistence-ish level of material well-being, welfare actually rises with material consumption, perhaps even at all. That's the topic taken on by the notorious Easterlin paradox, on which there's been a lively debate within economics over the last 40 years or so. Let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, though, that well-being does indeed rise with per capita income, even way above the subsistence level, roughly as in the standard utility functions one finds in economics textbooks. Taking that starting point, Tyler Cowen seems to suggest that for long-termist reasons, in particular if you have a zero discount rate for future well-being, boosting growth is going to be the very best thing one can do, where the thought is roughly, suppose we do something now that boosts consumption by a fixed amount now, and suppose further that that consumption boost grows over time at the background, suppose positive and perhaps roughly constant rate of economic growth. Then in the future, at every future time, you have people being perhaps significantly better off in material terms than they otherwise would have been. And so perhaps it seems plausible that when you aggregate all these well-being gains across the course of a potentially very long-run future, the benefits from this economic growth boost might be really quite enormous. Thus, Cowan defends what he calls the principle of growth, which says we should make political choices, and I think Cowan would equally say altruistic decisions in general, so as to maximize the rate of sustainable economic growth. In this talk, I'm just going to briefly make the comment, it's been made many times before, that this argument seems in danger of neglecting the conjunction of two things. Firstly, the likelihood that future consumption grows significantly, and secondly, the diminishing marginal utility of consumption. Putting those two things together, it seems somewhat plausible that even if it is the case that an economic growth boost now would generate highly significant consumption gains in the future, if it's the case that the future is far richer, then it could well be that even so the utility gains in the far future dwindle into insignificance in such a way that even when you aggregate, perhaps across the course of an infinite future time, if you have an infinite time horizon model, even then the overall welfare gain from an economic growth boost might be relatively insignificant. Now, ultimately, like most things, of course, this comes down to a matter of crunching the numbers, but I think this is a good plausibility argument for growth not being enormously important, specifically for this kind of reason. What about Friedman's argument? Friedman writes, the value of a rising standard of living lies not just in the concrete improvements it brings to how individuals live, as discussed in the argument on the previous slide, but also in how it shapes the social, political, and ultimately the moral character of a people. Economic growth, more often than not, fosters greater tolerance of diversity, social mobility, commitment to fairness, and dedication to democracy. Even societies that have already made great advances in these very dimensions, for example, most of today's Western democracies, are more likely to make still further progress when their living standards rise. Okay, I think this is an important line of thought, potentially. I don't have anything to say by way of evaluating it. For the purpose of this talk, I just want to flag this argument because it's going to be somewhat important later on when I get to digging into some of the arguments concerning existential risk, so I'll come back to this. Thirdly, then, economic growth and existential risk. Let existential risk fanaticism be the point of view according to which an existential catastrophe, if it happened, would be so astronomically bad that whenever there's just about any difference in existential risk at stake, the better action tends to be just whichever action induces lower existential risk. Despite the derogatory name, what I propose, for the sake of argument at least, is that we embrace this so-called fanatical point of view and see what follows from it. If one embraces this kind of fanaticism, then if somebody asks, would faster economic growth be better, for example, then one answers, as with everything else, well, that depends on what the sign of the effect of faster economic growth would be on existential risk. We want to know whether faster economic growth would decrease or instead increase existential risk. The remainder of my talk makes some forays into tackling that question. So as I said, I want to lean on the distinction between state risks and transition risks, and then apply that specifically to the case of existential risks. The distinction is about as clear as the notion of a state, but I think that's tolerably clear for present purposes. A state risk is a risk that has a constant rate per unit time for each so-called state that a person or civilization might be in. So at the individual level, the state of standing at the bottom of a crumbly cliff is a state that carries state risk. For every hour that you spend in that state, there's a certain roughly constant probability that you get hit on the head by a falling rock. At a larger scale, another state that carries state risk is the state in which 5% of asteroids that might be on a collision course with Earth remain untracked. For every year that humanity spends in that state, there's a certain roughly constant probability that one of these untracked objects comes and wipes us out. Transition risks, instead of being associated with the passage of time while you're in some given state, as the name suggests, these are associated with transitions from one state to another. So at the individual level, crossing the road is a dangerous activity. You can think of that as a transition risk associated with the transition from being on one side of the road to being on the other side of the road. At the larger scale, consider the transition from a state in which the world is run by humans to a state in which the world is run in some sense or another by a superhuman level artificial general intelligence, or more than one such. That's a transition that carries significant transition risk because there are various different versions of the second state, and it's the moment of transition that largely determines which version of the second state we end up stuck with. Okay, so I'm going to consider state risks first and then go on to thinking about transition risks. From the point of view of economic growth and existential state risks, the main thing seems to be the consideration of getting through the so-called time of perils. So here's the line of thought, roughly. First thought, at any given level of progress, we face a certain amount of existential state risks. For example, at the moment, we face existential state risks from asteroids, from nuclear war, from pandemics. Second thought, what you might call the existential security hypothesis. This state of affairs is temporary. We'll get through it. Once we've progressed far enough, we will reach a state in which existential state risks are near zero. And then you might think speeding up economic growth is going to be a good thing from this point of view, because it just squashes the graph in time, as it were. It gets you through the time of perils quicker. Total existential state risk is the area under the curve. And so if you speed things up, then you have a lower area under the curve, you have lower total existential state risk. So this is a powerful line of thought. I think it's broadly correct. Whether the third thing is true, however, seems to depend a bit on which version of the existential security hypothesis is true. So this is my main comment on this argument. If you think that the correct existential security hypothesis is 2A, society becomes rich enough that rational utility maximizers become willing to pay for safety measures, then you're going to buy the argument on the first half of this slide. So this version of the existential security hypothesis says, what's preventing us from having existential safety at the moment is that we're just not yet rich enough for it to be rational for us to be willing to pay enough for existential safety. What we need is more economic growth. When we get richer, because of the declining marginal utility of consumption, it will then become rational for us to pay for this expensive existential safety. And so we'll go ahead and do it. So that security hypothesis would underwrite the argument. It seems to me, though, that this is not an especially plausible form of the existential security hypothesis. There are already several well-argued pieces out there arguing that it would already be extremely cost-effective to pay substantially more than we're currently doing for greater existential safety. It seems like it's something else that's holding us back from doing that. What might that other thing be? One suggestion is offered in the narrative of Toby Ord's book, The Precipice. In Ord's narrative, the problem we currently face is that our technological abilities far outstrip our level of wisdom. We've got these newfound technological capabilities which generate unprecedented existential threats. Wisdom is lagging behind. We haven't yet got our act together to face up to these risks, coordinate appropriately, and take the appropriate action in response to the new risks. So from this point of view, you might think what we need to get us through the time of perils is progress in wisdom. And if so, then when we're thinking about economic growth, the question would be, does economic growth speed up progress in wisdom? My guess is that the answer to this question is also yes, although this case seems somewhat less clear-cut. You might think that there are, for example, Kuhnian effects at play here, where to some extent the progress of wisdom is significantly limited by the passage of time, independent of what the economic growth rate is doing. Because, for example, one thing we might need is for the old generation with their fixed ideas to retire, and the fresh young things who've been brought up with the new ideas to take over. There's also a third version of the existential security hypothesis, which says what's eventually going to get us out of the time of perils is that we'll get friendly artificial general intelligence, and that will then figure out the solutions to all these other non-AI risks for us. If that's the case, then again, it does seem like speeding economic growth will be a good thing from the point of view of this consideration. You'll get AGI sooner if you have faster economic growth, presumably. On the other hand, it would be naive to run that argument without also considering whether changes to the economic growth rate might affect the probability that what we end up with is indeed friendly artificial general intelligence, rather than some less friendly thing. It seems like insofar as there is any effect on the probability there, that's likely to be the more important consideration. So this takes us on to the notion of transition risk, which I turn to next. When you're thinking about transition existential risks, perhaps the transition from not yet having artificial general intelligence to having it, it seems like the main thing one will want to focus on is a consideration of optimal timing, from the point of view of economic growth, that is. When would it be better to have the dangerous transition happen earlier or instead later? Here's an argument that thinks about that question. First premise, at given points in the trajectory of economic development, certain transitions will occur, for example, from no AGI to AGI, that generate transition existential risks. Second premise, the size of these transition X risks depends on the state of some other parameter, which is itself relatively independent of economic development at the time of the transition in question. Thirdly, if it's the case that this other parameter will take on lower risk values at later times, then it would follow, point 4, that faster economic growth tends to increase transition X risks. If you've got progress going on so that the transition would be less risky if it happened later, then you want to slow down economic growth in order to make it the case that the dangerous transition happens later. Of course, one can also run premise 3 with the opposite sign if the other parameters take on lower risk values at earlier times, so in that sense you've got regress, then faster economic growth would tend to decrease transition X risks. Okay, so that's an abstract argument schema. I then want to consider two instantiations of this schema. The first to do with the idea of moral progress, the second to do with the idea of buying time. So on moral progress, suppose the transition we're thinking about is from no AGI on the one hand to having AGI which empowers a human agency on the other hand. So the type of existential threat we're thinking about here is perhaps AGI falls into the hands of a dictator who then uses its supreme power, AGI-fueled supreme power, to instantiate something like a permanently locked-in, non-welfare conducive totalitarian government. If that's the thing we're worrying about, then the other parameter that seems salient is how welfare conducive one would expect the values of the human agency that would get the AGI to be at different points in time. That is, very roughly, do we in general expect to have moral progress, values getting better as time passes, or do we expect moral regress? Well, here there are somewhat sketchy arguments on both sides. I'm not aware of anything particularly conclusive. I'll just record my own guess. My own guess is that moral progress is somewhat more likely than moral regress. And if so, then this line of thought generates an argument that, as far as these considerations go, slower economic growth would be better. We think we're going to have moral progress happening as time passes, so we want this type of AGI transition, if it happens at all, to happen later in time. A potentially major caveat to that line of argument, though, is what you might call the Friedman effect. If it's the case that faster economic growth in itself is a key driver of moral progress, then it would be counterproductive to try to, say, slow down moral progress in order to buy more time for moral progress to happen. Point 3 on this slide, suppose we're thinking about a different kind of transition. Suppose we're thinking instead about the transition from having no AGI on the one hand to having AGI itself directly running the world, rather than running the world by giving supreme power to some human agency. Then it seems like the relevant other parameter might be progress in safety research. So then the question would be, do we expect the amount of safety research that's happened, or the amount of progress in safety research that's been attained, rather, to be greater or less in a world where economic growth has proceeded more slowly and consequently AGI has been attained later, or instead in a world where economic growth has proceeded more quickly and so AGI has been attained sooner? Well, presumably slowing economic growth would slow down both progress towards AGI and progress in safety research. It seems plausible, though, to conjecture that safety research would be slowed down less. And if so, then again, here we would have a consideration that favours slower economic growth. You might expect you'd have attained more progress in safety research by the time AGI hits, if the whole process has been slowed down and AGI hits later. So to summarise, the direct well-being arguments a la Cowan, I've suggested, following many others, that these arguments might fail to leverage the signs of the future to generate enormous welfare gains from boosts to economic growth, at least. I've mentioned but not evaluated Friedman's argument concerning the moral consequences of economic growth. And then as for effects on existential risk, I suggested it would be fruitful here to distinguish between state risks and transition risks. It looks plausible that state risk arguments seem to favour faster economic growth, while transition risk arguments, at least the ones that I've walked through, seem to favour slower economic growth. If I was forced to draw a conclusion drawing together all the considerations of this talk and draw a conclusion with a determinant valence, it looks like following my arguments where they lead is going to suggest that slower economic growth might decrease existential risk, because it seems to me that the transition risks are more significant than the state risks. That's, of course, a somewhat uncomfortable conclusion to be forced to draw. So it's maybe worth pausing a moment to think of how one might resist that conclusion, aside from irrational reluctance to challenge the orthodoxy. That's a psychologically natural reason to resist the conclusion, but not an intellectually respectable one. What might we say that's more intellectually respectable? Well, one thing is, like many other things, this is going to come down to crunching the numbers. I haven't crunched the numbers. I've just aggregated across various considerations in an extremely hand-wavy qualitative way. So in some sense, of course, the jury is still out. Secondly, it might be the Friedman effect is really significant. That could reverse the sign of the conclusion quite easily, if so. Thirdly, there have been various places in these arguments where I've had to insert my own best guess about the sign of some parameter, some consideration. If I've made mistakes in doing that an odd number of times, that would reverse the sign of the conclusion. Fourthly, the whole argument is marginal. That is, I haven't taken on the question of what's the optimal level of economic growth. There might be good grounds for suspicion there, and until and unless we've seen what should be said about that other thing. And fifthly, plausibly, it might be important to disaggregate growth more than I have. I've just been thinking of growth as this monolithic global thing. I haven't disaggregated by either geographical region or say economic sector. So perhaps there's something interesting lurking there. There are my references.
Thank you for sharing these arguments. One question that many in our audience were interested in is, say these conclusions are correct and slower economic growth is safer overall. Is there any way we could implement such a policy that people today would find acceptable? Or are the incentives of current generations doing this blind?
Sure, yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I mean, I think there's a more dicey and a less dicey version of this, right? The more dicey thing is to actively try to slow down economic growth. What's less dicey is to refrain from actively going out of your way to promote economic growth, right? So if you've reached the conclusion that from the point of view of existential risk, slower economic growth will be better, then you're not going to be spending, say, your philanthropic dollars actively trying to push for faster economic growth. Whereas, for example, Cowen thinks so that's what we should all be doing.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then another question is, you've talked about the distinction between transition and state risks, with the transition to a world in which AI is much more influential as an example of these. So what are some other examples of transition risks?
Do you mean specifically transition existential risks or just transition risks in general?
Maybe could you touch on both?
Sure. I mean, I guess here's a general thing that does touch on both. So, I mean, the abstract thing that's going on with the AGI case, which makes it a case of transition risk, is you've got a kind of lock-in event happening there. So you've got more than one possible future. Some of the possible features substantially better, some of the possible features substantially worse, and it's a matter of risk which one of those you end up in. And then because of that, the transition from not yet locked in to locked in is a transition risk. So like thinking in terms of that abstract schema, you can then see it all over the place. And one salient category of other places where you see it will be in certain kinds of political events, for instance, political agreements broadly construed. So climate agreements could be an example of this. Anything resembling a new constitution, whether for a country or for some larger entity. And then in particular, applying that now to existential risks, any kind of major political agreement that is relevant to the management of some existential risk, for example, any major agreement on the Biological Weapons Convention, something like that. This might be fruitfully thought of in terms of this framework.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you. And then we mentioned earlier that you're director of the Global Priorities Institute, which does foundational research in how people and individuals and institutions can do the most good. So if some of our audience members are interested in collaborating with you, how should they go about doing this?
I mean, in the first instance, I'd encourage them to just reach out either by email or fill in the expression of interest form on the GPI website. We run 3 workshops a year, so that often provides a good kind of first step for somebody who's interested in finding out a bit more about GPI and meeting more of the researchers there to come and spend a couple of days chatting and hearing more about some of our research, specifically for early career researchers. So this is like people currently doing PhDs or just a couple of years out of their PhD. We have a 4-week program in the summer, our early career conference program, where people can come to Oxford, COVID permitting, and spend 4 weeks working with us on a research project that's within the broad remit of GPI. So I think those would be the main things I'd suggest in the first instance.
Yeah, thank you. That sounds great. That's all we have time for this session. So thank you so much for a fantastic session and for your time with us today.